Hocalarım merhaba, günaydın, nasılsınız? Günaydın, çok teşekkür ederim. Sizi görmek çok büyük onur ve çok büyük keyif, sizleri ağırlamak. Çok teşekkür ederim, bizi
Bizim de
kırmadınız.
öyle, çok teşekkürler.
Davet ettiğiniz için biz teşekkür ederiz.
Çok
Evet.
sağ olun hocam, çok teşekkür ederim.
Günaydın.
Sizi görmek, sizinle konuşmak çok büyük onur ve keyif verici.
Bizim için
Katıldığınız için çok teşekkür ederim.
Gülçin, sana da merhaba.
Merhaba.
Görüşemedik, burada görüşebildik.
Aynen. Çok yıllar oldu değil mi?
Evet, çok yıllar oldu. Yani ara ara Aydın'ı gördüğüm oldu ama seni herhalde 20 yıl falan oldu görelim.
Olmuştur. Ben hayal meyal şeyi hatırlıyorum. İstanbul'da bir Marmara Otel'de bir konferans vardı. Finans konferansı vardı. Orada gördüğümü hatırlıyorum en son.
Ben de sanki yani deniz kenarında bir yemekte oturduk diye hatırlıyorum.
Yok,
Yani
o ben değilimdir. Hatırlardım.
Yılında mı yani akşam bir yemekte oturduk konuştuk diye
Yok,
hatırlıyorum.
ben değilim o.
Acaba öbür şey mi, Özkan mı?
Olabilir.
Ama
Neyse.
hayır, onun yüzünü senden, yani onu biliyorum senden farklı.
O daha
Neslihan
yakın
Hoca
konularda
olabilir.
çalışıyor galiba.
Neslihan Hoca,
O daha
Neslihan.
yakın konularda çalışıyor, o yüzden onunla daha sık görüştüğüm oldu.
Doğru,
Yani
doğru.
yüz yüze de gördüğüm oldu, daha sık görüştüğüm de oldu. Ama bak kısmet, yani artık
Aynen.
pandemi açılırsa Londra'da da görüşelim.
Aynen, aynen.
Hocam Neslihan Hoca mı acaba lafınızı
Evet.
bağlayıp Neslihan Hoca olabilir mi? Bristol'dan belki Neslihan
Evet.
Hoca olabilir.
Öyle.
Şenay Hocam hoş geldiniz. Çok teşekkür ederim.
Hoş bulduk. Ben teşekkür ederim. Günaydınlar. Merhaba Gülnur Hocam, Gülçin Hocam.
Günaydın,
Günaydın.
hoş geldiniz.
Hocam
Sizi
ismen
görüşebilmek çok güzel oldu ama böyle kısmetmiş.
Hocam isimlerinizi biliyordum. Hani çalışmalarınızdan ama kariyerlerinize bakınca şöyle bir çok gurur duydum ülkem adına ama yurt dışındasınız. Az önce de bir gazetecinin yazısı vardı. Neden bu arkadaşlarla gurur duyuyoruz ama onlar neden Türkiye'de değiller? Yurt dışındalar diye. Hani Amerika'da bir karı koca hani bu Covid-19 ile ilgili olarak şeyleri var. Yani bilemedim. Ama çok güzel. Ben de
hani insan nerede iş bulursa orada çalışıyor, öyle diyeyim size. Hani
hocam,
siz
evet.
de hani şey gibi, hani niye İstanbul'dasın da Ankara'da değilsin, yahut ne bileyim hani Trabzonlusun da niye Ankara Üniversitesi'nde çalışıyorsun gibi bir şey.
Ya da hocam Rize'de olup Rizeli olup Rize Üniversitesi'nde çalışanlar hocam.
İşte onun gibi, yani herkes Rizeli değil Rize Üniversitesi'nde çalışanların. Hani Rizelisin ama gidip Adana'da çalışabiliyorsun, yahut Mersin'de çalışabiliyorsun veya Ankara'da çalışabiliyorsun. Onun gibi yani, hani
Evet.
dünya ne diyeyim,
Bir
global
artık.
dünya.
Saat 8 değil mi hocam sizin orada şu an? 3 saat farkınız var galiba.
Saat
8.
8, evet.
Günaydın.
Günaydın.
Hocam aynı zamanda Oliver Hoca da burada. Ben şöyle küçük bir İngilizce girizgah yapıp
Tabii.
sonra da değerli Şenay Hocam'a bırakacağım sözü. So welcome to our second day for the International Conference on Different Aspects of Health. It's really a great honor for us to welcome our moderator, our two distinguished presenters. So today's panel is going to be about, finance, economics and health. So I would like to introduce our moderator. I'm sure she's going to introduce each of our keynote speakers. So Professor Dr. Şenay AÇIKGÖZ, she's from University of Hacı Bayram, which is based in Ankara. So there we go. Thank you.
I think it's my turn.
Yes, please.
Okay. Good morning one more time. As Merve said, I'm from Ankara Hacı Bayram Veli University and Department of Econometrics, if I give another detail. And I'm also welcoming you to the conference on different aspects of health. And it's a pleasure to moderate this second session of the day. And it is entitled as Finance, Economics and Health. And today, I'm also hosting two distinguished professors, and I'm also thanking to Merve and organization committee for having me as a moderator. And before we start, I would like to summarize their academic career. Maybe we can skip, but I would like to do that. Professor dear Gülçin Özkan is a professor of finance at King's Business School. She holds her master's degree from the University of Warwick and PhD from the University of York. And her main research interest focuses on the intersection of microeconomics. And when I read the whole story, I can say that almost every aspect of finance. And she's been the managing editor of the Bulletin of Economic Research since 2013. And she published her papers in distinguished journals. And our second presenter is dear Gülnur MURADOİ, and she is also professor of finance. And she works for Queen Mary University of London. And she's also the director of the Behavioral Finance Working Group, and her research focuses on behavioral finance and emerging markets. And Professor Gülnur Hocam, I saw that you are associate editors of many journals, distinguished journals. I'm happy to see all these things. And before we start, I also want to give the period of our session. Each presenter will have 20 minutes for their presentations, and they will have another 5 minutes to have questions and answers. Now I'll leave the floor to Professor Gülçin Özkan to present her article entitled COVID-19 and the Economy Twin Crisis. You may start, Professor.
Thank you very much to both of you for inviting us. It's really a great pleasure to be speaking to you. Obviously, speaking to you personally would have been nicer, but on other occasions in future. So I'm going to share my screen in a moment. I have hesitated a lot in choosing whether to include a general presentation going over what we have gone through over the last 6-7 months. I've asked Merve a couple of times whether this would be the case or whether I should present more detailed results. At least I decided to combine the two. So I'm going to start by giving you what I see as anatomy of where we have been regarding clearly the economic effects of the pandemic, and then say a few words about how I would approach it as a macroeconomist. So I think you have disabled my screen sharing. If you could just
could you actually see that the green icon at the bottom of the screen?
Yes, it says host disabled participants.
Right. So I need to let the IT office and let you to share your screen. Sorry, just a second.
No,
I'm really sorry about that. Sorry, sorry for the delay. I'm really sorry.
No, it's fine. Don't worry. It's absolutely fine.
Can you actually try now? I think it should be okay at the moment. All right. Okay.
Is it visible?
Sorry about that. Yes.
Excellent. So I titled it as Twin Crisis, but it's a very different kind of twin crisis, as you will see in a moment. Excellent. So here is the plan of my talk. I would like to start by briefly mentioning what twin crises are and why I would call this a twin crisis. Then obviously we need to think about whether there were any precedents, any similar episodes in the past. Clearly we have to go 100 years, and that's the Spanish flu. I will say a few words about the economic effects of Spanish flu, and then clearly asking the question of why COVID-19 is different. And it's different, I'm going to argue that in terms of its economic effects, it's different why it's different. And then in the final part, I will say a few words about my own research regarding how we would approach understanding the economic effects of COVID-19 for advanced economies versus emerging economies, finishing with what is next. So for those of you, I know you are not all economists and maybe you are much less interested in this aspect of the question. For me, as an economist working at the intersection of macroeconomics and finance, this has been really such an interesting overlap of events that it's not the first time. We've had many twin crises before. When we talk about twin crises in economics, we talk about co-occurrence of debt crisis and banking crisis, currency crisis and banking crisis, debt crisis and currency crisis. And we have observed these many times, particularly since 1980s with the liberalization of financial markets globally. So if you think about Turkey 2001, it really was a co-occurrence of banking and currency crises. We observed many crises where both debt and currency issues were present, mostly in Latin America in 1980s. We have a combination of debt and banking crisis in Argentina, in Russia. We could even have triple crisis where you have all of these issues, like in Mexico early 90s and Korea late 90s. So these are very different kind of crises. Clearly, when we talk about COVID, COVID is entirely different. COVID is the combination of a health crisis and an economic crisis. When I was looking at the pictures, actually, I mean, I found this one from Reserve Bank of Australia. I was really surprised to see that this is really very similar to the scenes we might see today. I don't know why I was surprised. Clearly, the masks are not that new, but this picture could have easily been taken somewhere around the globe these days. So this was the previous very similar experience in terms of a pandemic, Spanish flu of 1918. So if this is the next thing that we need to analyze, which the profession has been doing for 100 years, but clearly a lot more frequently in the last 6-7 months with new data, with new analysis, with new methodology. So I will do the same here. I would like to have a look at the economic effects of that episode before making some parallels between the two.
Sorry, Professor, for interrupting. The IT was asking whether you can, make it the full screen. You can make a presentation full screen. They was just wondering whether it's...
Okay, let me just use that.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry about interrupting.
Here we have a picture of the impact, not on the economy just yet, but in terms of the number of deaths across the globe. So here we can see that Spanish flu, first of all, was very deadly episode with nearly 2% of the world population perishing as a result. So on that front, that was a much grave episode. How about in terms of the impact on the economy? I've seen this one, people have been using from that episode. This is a piece in Sydney in a newspaper article. Again, if you look at the title, it's really very, very similar. Shop trade hit, no crowds, big mail order business. So in terms of, how a pandemic is translated onto the economy, it's not hugely different. At least the starting point is very, very similar. Now here we have the impact of the Spanish flu on the real GDP growth between 1918 and close to 1920. We can see the drop in GDP growth. So clearly there's a contraction following the pandemic. We can have two other observations. First, that's not the worst episode in this period. Clearly the drop in GDP is significant, but small relative to other drops around this time. Secondly, and we don't need to have a look at this diagram to conclude that this is the period right after the First World War. So when we look at the economic effects, we really need to distinguish the effect of war from the effect of the pandemic. This is done by a new paper by Barrow and co-authors. And how can you do that? You obviously need cross-country evidence. They've used evidence from 44 countries, incorporating explicitly exposure in the war and exposure in the flu. And you can see that the conclusion is the flu seems to have had about 8% contraction, and the war seems to have a little bit higher, about 10% contraction. It's not small, but it's small in relative terms. So one other thing we can do, other than extending the sample to many countries, we can extend the sample to the city level or the state level. And this is done a lot. And this is, again, done a lot in the last 6 months. So this is really looking at the change in employment in different cities by differentiating between the interventions. These are non-pharmaceutical interventions. So the low ones are indicated by red dots and the green ones are high interventions. Clearly, we can see the impact on employment, whether you have low interventions versus high interventions. And this was one of the aspects that was discussed a lot and actually quite related to whether there's a trade-off between the health crisis and the economic crisis, whether you would be okay if you didn't have the interventions. Actually, I mean, this particular evidence, I think, refutes the claim that there is such a trade-off. If you are not dealing with the health crisis, you are really not dealing with the economic consequences of it as well. So this is kind of similar. Here we are not immediately looking at the economic effects, but indirectly, here we are looking at excess mortality in 1918, again in different cities, again vis-a-vis the speed and the intensity of those interventions. And clearly we can see that on both occasions, we have this clear link between having more interventions and having obviously better health outcomes that are translated into better economic outcomes. So how is COVID-19 different? I quite like this picture because this really in one picture tells us as a starting point how different it is. Here, obviously, we have a one-dimensional picture in the sense that we are only looking at what happens to the GDP relative to the business cycle. Here we have a number of episodes. So we are looking at episodes from 1980 recession, 1990 recession. This is for the US economy, but there are very similar pictures for other countries as well. So 2001 recession and the global financial crisis indicated by the blue line. And then we have the purple line indicating the COVID. Clearly, COVID is the sharpest of all in terms of the output drop in the immediate aftermath of the recession associated with this episode. So why is COVID that different from the Spanish flu? Obviously, I'm not making one-to-one comparisons. There are so many differences between the two, but I'm also looking at how COVID is different from other episodes, other crisis episodes by plotting it relative to other recessions and other crises. I would like to talk about two main differences between the global economy now and the global economy during the time of the Spanish flu. So the first one is clearly the huge, massive globalization during the last century, during the last half century. So here we have data from 1800, so about 200 years of data on the value of global exports. We can see that globalization is a relatively recent phenomenon, starting from 1950 onwards, and huge sharp rise in the volume and the value of global exports. So this tells us really, even with one picture, that countries now are a lot more interconnected than at the time of Spanish flu. So that clearly will have implications for how pandemic is transmitted from one country to the other. but equally and perhaps more importantly for our purposes is how economic impacts are also transmitted from one country to the others. The second observation to me is really key in terms of the differences in the structure of the global economy is the composition of total national income. That has also changed dramatically. I have the picture here for US economy, but again, we have very similar pictures for most other particularly advanced economies. So if we look at the beginning of this period, the beginning of 1800s, really most economies were agriculture based. The share of the agriculture in total income is more than 80%, and the share of services and manufacturing tiny. So another 100 years, clearly we can see the trend. Agriculture, the share of agriculture is going down steadily all through this period. And then another 100 years, we can see that it is really mostly services. Agriculture is a very small part, and even manufacturing is a small part. This again clearly tells us that the transmission is very different in a service intensive industry in relation to one where it was based on agriculture alone. This picture I included to kind of reiterate that point made by the picture on the previous page. So this tells us about the employment losses between February and May in different sectors, and different sectors are categorized with respect to their physical proximity index, so whether they are contact intensive or not. So if we move to the right, we are moving towards more contact intensive industries. If we move from on the vertical axis, if we move below, we are moving to an area where the employment loss was greater. So if we look at where employment loss was greatest, we can see that it was basically recreation, accommodation, restaurants, airlines. So the areas where the physical proximity index took high values indicating contact intensive sectors. Now, I would like to point to an observation on this plot, which I'm going to return to later on. If you look at banking and telecommunications up around zero, clearly these are not contact intensive sectors, and they had minimal employment loss when compared with, I mean, not just when compared with others in absolute values as well. And that is coming from other recent analyses and satellite facts. So this is one positive aspect of the COVID crisis. Very different to global financial crisis. On this occasion, financial sector on the whole were not affected that much. Clearly, global financial crisis originated in the financial sector. So when you have a damage, significant damage in the financial sector, it takes a very, very long time to recover from the initial recession, as we have seen in the picture earlier. So here, what I would like to say on that is, once we have the resolution of the public health crisis, this suggests that there are reasons to be optimistic about a faster, much faster reversal from the recession, in complete contrast to global financial crisis. Having said that, in terms of the differentiations between different industries, no country is really left untouched by COVID. We can clearly see on the global map here, as we move from the orange to the red and then dark red, we are moving to areas where the contraction was greater and greater. So loss of output was getting greater and greater. And clearly you can see that there's almost no country that's not affected by the COVID-19 crisis. And here, look.
Excuse me, we are in the last 5 minutes.
Last 5 minutes. I think I should. So, moving from the global picture to the G7 picture. So here we have comparative data across G7 countries. The gray bars indicate the contraction in economic activity following COVID. Again, we can see that it's a very different episode and very different experience. The final 3 plots, I would like to show you some results from our analyses. So I'm an applied macroeconomist and I work mostly with dynamic stochastic models. So these are 2 sets of outcomes that we have produced by looking at, first, an advanced economy structure, second, an emerging economy structure. So the question, obviously the same, whichever set you look at, how do we understand the interactions and the channels through which a COVID crisis of the sort that we were experiencing are transmitted across countries? Now, in the case of the advanced economies, here are the results from our simulations. And these simulations are based on calibrations on the G7. So we would pick the parameters that are representative of these economies. And the outcomes are consistent with the data we have seen, huge drops between 10 and 20% in output, in consumption, in hours worked, in wage rate, in profits, leading the policymakers to reduce their policy rates, which was pretty much what was done by many of these countries. In the case of advanced economies, the interactions were through demand and supply shocks. Initially, obviously, it was the supply shocks arising from China being hit by the COVID-19 crisis, and that led to, through the global supply chains, supply-related impacts on advanced economies, followed by demand-related impacts. And this would be more or less a picture we would be facing if we are looking at an advanced economy. But emerging economies are very different. And I've spent much of my career looking at the differences between the two. And in terms of the emerging economies, clearly they are impacted directly through the pandemic effects, but they have also, as always the case, given their close reliance on financial markets in advanced economies, they're also affected through the dynamics in the financial markets. So this picture is really a summary of the relationships we have in our dynamic stochastic general equilibrium framework, creating these final 2 plots. So here we have the output equilibrium following from that shock, consumption and investment. In all cases, we can see a drop, a big drop in output, in consumption and in investment. And when we go from the green line to the blue line, we are increasing the size of the shock to match the observed contraction in economic activity. So in this scenario, we are not incorporating the impact through the financial markets. This set of results incorporate that and indicate that, in fact, for the emerging economies, there is another second round effects coming from the dynamics in the financial markets. And those are largely unfavorable. So what do I want to say to finish? This is an unprecedented episode by measures of, even by measures of the previous twin crises. In my view, this was mostly due to, even if leaving aside all the comparisons coming from COVID-19 as a health crisis, even on purely economic basis, there are good reasons to think that this would have been different anyway, due to the major changes in the structure of the global economy, as well as the nature of the policy response in terms of the extensive containment measures. So what would that mean looking ahead? This would mean that clearly twin crises would require twin resolution. We would need to resolution coming from the public health aspect first. And on that front, vaccination news couldn't have come at a better time. What do I mean by that? On that day, when the vaccination news came out, I was teaching graduate students. I think it was about 12 o'clock midday, and this was the response of the financial markets as of 12 with the news of the vaccination. And you can see how the economic agents respond to a potential resolution of such a crisis. So this really in itself, I don't need to say anything more, this in itself shows how important it is to get the resolution on the medical side before we can get the resolution on the economic side. I think I would like to stop at this point. I hope I'm my 20 minutes.
Everything was on time, Professor Gülçin Özkan. Thank you very much for this presentation. I think that you showed us the big picture of economic effects of COVID-19 pandemic. Now we have 5 minutes to receive questions to Professor Özkan. You're also welcome to give your comments about this topic.
I have a question, actually.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor. Such a brilliant presentation and very interesting results, by the way. I was really surprised to see that the COVID-19 has, more damage compared to Spanish flu on economy. So just, going back to the graph regarding the loss of job, I think, sorry, can we actually go back to the graph which shows the job loss by sectors, by different occupations? I was kind of wondering, yes, that one, thank you. So I was kind of wondering whether this is like an overall picture, including, many countries. Because my point is, different countries, countries might have different economies which are driven by different sectors. So one economy could be driven by, say, agricultural sector or education. For instance, the UK, I think, the UK economy partially could be driven by the economic activities, the education activities. So I kind of wonder whether, this is for, many countries, or is it possible
Sorry, Mary, I believe this is from G7.
Right.
It would not reflect clearly those differences, but we see that in the differences in the contraction, in the level of contraction. The UK is very services-based economy.
Exactly.
And UK's contraction has been the greatest, has been the greatest across the advanced economy. So clearly, depending upon your composition of your economy, the picture I showed you, how the services was going up and going down, that was for the US economy. Although we observe similar changes across other countries, obviously quantitatively it won't be exactly the same. Those differences will be reflected on those outcomes. But we need to also remember, which I haven't really talked about very much today, the policy responses play a big role.
Yeah, exactly.
How you respond to that. It's not just your structure, but how you respond to it. I know that there's a very active and in fact, very successful, in my view, a literature building since March, looking at those differences and mapping them to the outcomes. So having said that, UK is a little bit puzzling because UK is widely applauded as having introduced one of the best and most responsive set of policies. But that's not reflected. I mean, obviously, this is a question that's kind of contributed by a huge set of factors. I think the full picture will not be known once we are beyond and once we have the full numbers, because if you look at the first quarter numbers, they are very different. What's coming out. In fact, in the UK, the headline news yesterday was we bounced back in January, in July to September, but obviously expected to have another reversal given the new lockdown. So these things will have to even out, and we can have a look at the data, but ex post at this point in time, and we can only make partial observations.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Merve. Is there any other participants that have questions for Professor Gülçin Özkan? Yes, please, you go ahead.
I think it's more than a question. I think it's more of a comment.
Okay.
About the financial sector being shielded from the current policy response to COVID. because basically they can work from home. But I mean, in our presentations, we'll talk about bankruptcy predictions. So I'm assuming that the shock to the financial sector will be with a time lag. Because if we experience zombie firms, if we experience mass bankruptcies, we can't see the impact on the banking sector now. But it's very clear that it's not a banking sector crisis, or it's not a banking sector initiated crisis, but the sector can be pulled into that crisis with a time lag of maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years, but there is no way that they will be able to insulate themselves from the rest of the economy for a long while.
Could I respond to that?
Please, go ahead.
I think this is really an important aspect of this episode, and it's a difference between this one, a very clear difference between this one and global financial crisis, where the whole episode originated from the fragilities in the financial sector. So when the financial sector was hit by a financial shock of that magnitude, it took a very, very long time to recover from that. And we know that when the financial sector is fragile, real economy, the rebound on the real sector is very slow. And that's the reason why we have seen that picture for a very long time, 40, 42 months. In fact, even more than that, about 4 or 5 years, it took most economies to recover, advanced economies who were at the center of that financial shock. This time, financial sector seems to have been, at least not, if not yet, it will, with the bankruptcies in the real sector, transmitted onto the financial sector. So it's almost like second round effects that will be felt by the financial sector. So there might be repercussions later on down the line, but in terms of how it started, it's very, very different, and the type of the shock. So when we analyze it, in a dynamic stochastic framework where we look at the transmissions, we don't view this as a financial shock. We view this largely initially as a supply shock, and then a combination of a demand and supply shock, potentially productivity shock based on global value chains, but financial shock only for the emerging economies for now due to their reliance on international financial markets. But with some time lag, there might be very different dynamics.
Thank you very much. And before I leave the floor to Professor Gülnur Muradoğlu, I also would like to say something. Your graph showing the sectoral economic growth during the Spanish flu pandemic reminded me, or made me to ask you, do you expect that COVID-19 will change the regime, the growth process of individual countries, especially emerging countries? Do you expect regime changes? Are we gonna look at, when we look at back, are we gonna see there was a regime change during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Do you mean in terms of economic policy?
Yeah. Since I'm trying to become an econometrician, I see the things with the data mostly. So, when I look at the timeline, maybe it's going to create a structural change, or maybe it's going to create a regime change. The probability of data generating process will change if regime changes. So in terms of
I'm not entirely sure, to be very I think we have been observing regime changes over the last couple of decades. What new pictures emerging is countries clearly, we have known that we didn't need to have a pandemic experience to appreciate how closely linked we all are across countries. But the new picture that's appearing, and it's not a new picture out of the COVID, but it's a new picture out of globalization over the last few decades, is countries are very closely linked, and these linkages are different and work through different channels. That, that's a very kind of common observation as well. But there is more specifics of it, the Chinese impact, the impact of Chinese policies, largely monetary policies, are transmitted mostly onto advanced economies through those global supply chains, and US policies are transmitted onto mostly emerging economies through the financial markets channel. This episode doesn't make me think that it's going to be any different.
Okay,
Only that perhaps these are intensified. At least as of now, I don't think it's going to lead to a huge regime shift. I don't think so.
Okay, thank you very much. And now, Professor MURADOİ will present her joint work with Professor Dr. Oliver Haltemöller, who is the Vice President of Halle Institute for Research Economy. And Professor Gülnur MURADOİ, please, you may start.
Thank you.
I think Gülçin Hocam,
you need to stop sharing, sorry.
Sharing, yes.
Yeah.
You have 20 minutes, but I'm sure we will cover everything.
Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much. My co-author, Oliver, is also in the session, so some of the questions he can answer as well. And in case I have technical difficulties, he can interfere and continue with the presentation as well. Hope we don't have them. So the basic motivation of the study was Oliver and I were working on a separate issue, and we're working on a very rich European database, and then the crisis broke down. So as the crisis broke down, we started talking, and then as we started talking, then we started thinking, well, maybe let's have a look at what's happening at the European firms. So the trigger for us was the policy response to the crisis. I mean, neither of us are medical doctors, so we absolutely don't have any idea about the several different alternative policy responses in containing a virus, any virus or this virus. But the policy response to this in terms of shutdowns, we could see that that would have an immense effect at the firm level, at the corporate level. And what we're looking at is basically a combination of two things, the virus itself and the response to the virus in terms of shutdowns, the policy response in terms of shutdowns. So what we really want to do is we want to look at the consequences of the shutdown, and that's due to the corona crisis and the consequences in terms of the risk of bankruptcy. We have estimations we have clearer estimations on the larger economies in Europe, and we have kind of like robust estimations on the rest of Europe, but we'll be presenting Germany and UK, the largest two economies in Europe, where we both live now. Now, the first thing I want to touch upon is the unprecedented nature of the corona crisis. Well, as Gülçin has detailed, the 2008 crisis, or previously the Great Depression, these are all triggered by the financial sector. This time, the crisis is triggered by the policy response to a virus. And the policy response was basically social distancing, and therefore the shutdowns on human contact industry sectors with human contact. And the initial estimates from the Bank of England about the fall in output was about 14%. And the only crisis similar to that in UK history is a crisis in 1709, which I didn't know about. So I had to look back and see what the crisis was. And in fact, that one was not a demand side crisis, but a supply side crisis. What happened was the climate change, ice came down and the earth froze, and it's an agricultural economy at that time, and therefore output was limited. So they couldn't produce food, and therefore there were debts, and therefore there was shrinkage in the economic activity, etc. And in Germany, at the time, the government expected a decline of more than 6%. That's more than that's more than the decline during the 2008 crisis, and that's more than the decline in GDP during the Second World War. So we estimate the risk of bankruptcy because of the shutdowns. It's very clear that, you know, when you shut down a sector, well, the sales will drop, and what happens to the risk of bankruptcy for these firms. So what happens is, well, number one, the firms can be liquidated, or the survivor firms can encounter several difficulties later. They can continue to have negative earnings for long periods. They may not be able to make any additional investments for extended periods. They might need debt restructuring, or they might try to survive with very high debt ratios. And they might even be forced to make liquidation decisions. And they can have some sort of long-term distress. And that's what that's what I was kind of like pointing at in terms of the contagion of a purely demand-initiated crisis to trigger another crisis in the financial sector. So, or there is a whole literature about zombie firms. These are firms, you know, that should be dead, but for some reason they're still alive. So they live, but no one knows how they survive, why they don't go bankrupt, etc. So maybe there will be a cohort of zombie firms, and we'll have to deal with new policy initiatives to turn them back to life. So we thought that at this point it's important to indicate that the policy response generates widespread distress in the corporate sector. And we thought this is important in designing long-term policies because, I mean, this probably is not going to be the last pandemic that we will have to deal with. Human life became much more important since the Spanish flu crisis. So we thought we should point that out. So we look at United Kingdom and Germany, and the other European countries have very similar profiles, but I'm going to present you the United Kingdom and Germany. And the results are very striking because almost all firms in the shutdown industries, about 98, 99%, face a risk of bankruptcy. And the furlough schemes reduce this risk of bankruptcy only marginally. And we're expecting that there will be contagion in terms of a fall in demand in sectors that are not shut down. And they do face a significant risk of bankruptcy as well. The data we're using is from Amadeus, and the strength of the data is that it's not only listed firms. So it's unlisted firms. We look at micro firms with less than 10 people working in them. We look at small firms. We look at medium firms, and we look at large firms. So that considers a large part of the corporate sector. And it's not limited to the specifics of the very large firms that are listed in the stock exchanges. So overall, the sample we're using encompasses approximately 30 to 60% of employment in these countries. We include all industries and we include all size groups. So this is a general picture of the distribution of the variables that we're using, and they seem to be as expected. In terms of measuring distress and the risk of bankruptcy, what we're basically using is the interest coverage ratio. So that's the ratio of the earnings to the interest expense. So how much of the interest expense does the earnings cover? We use the inverse of it to show whether interest can be paid by the earnings of the company. Because if the interest cannot be paid, then that's reason to go bankrupt, isn't it? So the debt holders will come and negotiations will start for bankruptcy. The second measure we're using here, it's not a traditional measure, but we use a payables coverage ratio. Because during the pandemic, during the first 2 or 3 weeks of the pandemic response, for example, one of the largest retail companies in Britain, Debenhams, applied for administration. And the government has a furlough scheme, so they don't have to pay their employees. The government allowed rent not to be paid. If rent is not paid, then the landlord cannot force them out. So they're not under risk of being kicked out of their shops. But they applied for administration because of their suppliers. They couldn't pay their accounts payable. They couldn't pay their suppliers because there was no cash outflow. The shops were closed, no cash inflow, and they couldn't pay the suppliers. And therefore, due to account payables, they had to apply for administration. Similarly, recently last week, Edinburgh Mill, and again, a very big and very old this time, chain store, a retail store on clothing, they had to apply for administration for similar reasons because of their accounts payable. So we look at the payable coverage ratio as well, whether they can cover their payables through their earnings. We look at the shutdown measures and we use the actual turnover data, and we calculate a year-on-year change in monthly turnover in every industry. So rather than looking at the government list of industries, we have done that as well. The results are robust, but we're using a more conservative approach. And we're looking at any fall larger than a 2 standard deviation. So if the fall in revenue is more than 2 standard deviation of the past 20 or so years, then we define the industry as a shutdown industry. So, and that includes really all the sectors that are shut down by the government. And our measure is much more conservative than using the list coming from the government. I mean, have a look at these numbers, for example. In Germany, motor vehicles, in April, the fall in revenue in the industry as a whole was 75%, or retail sale of automotives in the UK, the fall as of April was about 65% year on year. The first set of findings I'll be talking about is the financial indicators for the firms in the shutdown industries. These are basically retail type of industries, and they have more human contact, and also they have more fragile financial structures. So in the shutdown industries, the leverage, for example, is higher, retained earnings is less, profitability ratios are lower, and the shutdown sectors depend very much on generating high level of sales, and that's another demonstration of their fragility. The interest expense scaled by their profitability is higher in the shutdown industries, and the ratio of payables is higher in the shutdown industries, and the ratio of payables to both earnings and to sales is higher in those industries. So in general, those retail firms are more fragile than firms in other industries. So I'm going to skip the tables, but if you have any questions later, I can come back to the tables. When we look at the several ratios in the shutdown industries, in terms of leverage, for example, the administrative services has about 60% in leverage. So 60% of their funding is coming from external sources. The wholesale and retail in Germany, that's about 64%. When you look at the debt service obligations, the general ratio of interest to their earnings is about 15% in both countries. The ratio of payables is about 8-10% in the two countries. So let me give a brief note about the interest coverage ratio that we're using. So in a rough manner, not at all scientific, but most practitioners use a rough 1.5 to 2 times the earnings as a livable interest coverage ratio. So below that, usually the lenders refuse to lend anymore to the company. And the risk for default for the company is assumed to be very high. So for us, the measure of distress is more conservative than that. So if the company cannot pay its interest obligation through the earnings that they have, then we consider the firm as under distress. So when we look at the percent of firms under distress in general is about 5 to 8% in all the countries. So being under risk of distress doesn't mean that you necessarily apply for distress, apply for bankruptcy. And the ratio of firms that are bankrupt, actually bankrupt, are in the range of 1 to 2% in the economy. So we simulated the shutdowns by assuming we simulated a 1-month shutdown, a 2-month shutdown, and a 3-month shutdown scenario in both countries.
Hocam, you have 4 minutes to go.
So from 1 month to 3 months, more than 90% of firms in both countries have a risk of bankruptcy. A 3-month shutdown is almost all firms fall into a risk of bankruptcy. Almost the whole of the economy and the labor market and the rest of the economic activity will be disturbed heavily. We simulated furloughs. Furlough might be a new word and is extensively used in the UK. And that means that the government shutdowns the firms, say you don't go to work, say you're working for a restaurant, and they give about 70 to 80% of your salary and you sit at home, don't go to work. So we assume that the labor is paid by the government through the furlough schemes. And the impact on the risk of bankruptcy is marginal. So from about 99%, the risk falls down to, say, 94%, 95%. In non-shutdown industries, again, there will be a contagion from the shutdown industries. For example, well, you can sell cars if you want to online, but nobody goes and buys cars because nobody's going to work anymore. So there will be an effect on the other industries, and that's also considerable. The risk of bankruptcy is in the range of 60%, 60 to 70%. We look at different size of firms, micro firms. Again, the risk of bankruptcy is very high. In non-shutdown industries, again, these are the very small firms, but the risk of bankruptcy is very high in the range of 50 to 60%. In small firms, the risk of bankruptcy is again 98, 99% for shutdown firms, about 60, 70% for non-shutdown firms. The medium firms, again, the same thing, shutdown firms, 98, 99%, non-shutdown firms, about 60, 70%. And similarly in large firms, again, in shutdown industries, almost all of them are under risk of bankruptcy. I mean, this is still in progress. So we would appreciate any comments that you have, and any comments, any questions, etc. We would appreciate them. And what we're trying to do is to show the consequences at the firm level of the policy response to a health crisis. We're not sure, we're not medical doctors. Maybe health professionals can come up with different policy responses, but the corporate sector impact of this policy response introduces a very high risk of bankruptcy to the firms. And that could, we don't look at the subsequent impact on job losses, obviously, but probably there will be other colleagues looking into them. And that's all. So your comments, questions are all very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Professor Dr. Gülnur MURADOİ, for your great presentation. And yeah, we are expecting your questions or comments about this paper.
I ask a very naive question.
Okay, please go ahead.
I have no exposure to this set of data, so this is the first time I'm seeing these kind of outcomes. What strikes me is your simulations, almost all of the subsample, the ratio of bankruptcy, or at least the ones that you identify as more likely to go bankrupt, is higher for the case of Germany than for the UK. For some reason, I would have expected the opposite. Is there an explanation why you are getting that consistent results, that it's more likely for these firms to go bankrupt in Germany?
Well, I mean, Oliver can answer that better, but remember that initially, the percent of firms under normal circumstances that cannot cover their interest rate is higher in Germany than in the UK. It's about 8% in Germany and 5% in the UK anyway. So the interest coverage ratio, according to the interest coverage ratio, in general, there are more firms in Germany that don't cover their interest rate. One possible, I mean, it's not tested, but one possible explanation could be UK is more market oriented and Germany is more bank oriented system. Yeah. And therefore, if the firm is under risk of bankruptcy and they have a long-standing relationship with the bank, and the debt is coming through the bank rather than through the bonds, but obviously the banks will carry the bad debts.
So maybe that's more sustainable than when you are borrowing directly from the markets. I mean, these are really strange to me, because if you think about the COVID, the response to COVID, one would expect Germany to have done better on almost all of those parameters. This is really interesting to find out. So I'd be very interested
for
from
pointing
Oliver if
Oliver,
there are other reasons why.
On to it.
So in Germany, the ratio of sales to total assets is higher than in the UK. So if you lose a certain share of your turnover, that is a larger amount in money, right?
Okay, so they would be more kind of sensitive to containment measures than would have been the case in the UK.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the turnover is larger in relation to profit.
Okay.
On average. Yeah.
Profit margins are lower. Therefore, they're more fragile.
So could I ask one more question? So
Please go ahead.
So you have a specific definition of how to categorize firms to, you know, those that are likely to go bankrupt. Do you have plans to expose check against actual bankruptcies?
Yes, we will. So, I mean, at this stage, we stopped working on this. So we're circulating to get feedback as to what to do next. And we're waiting for the actual balance sheets to come, which will be about next March, to do the calculations on the actual balance sheets.
I think it would be really nice if you had that analysis of probability of those two matching. That would be really interesting.
Yeah, let me make a note of it. So maybe we can have a look at the probability of the actual versus the estimated.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, because what we're planning to do now, I mean, we discussed about it last week, but we decided not to look at that because the interim statements, the first quarter results are out now. But, well, it's March, which is kind of like even the beginning of the pandemic. So the reasonable ones will be the end of year, which will be available as of March next year. And we'll definitely look at the actuals and compare
Okay.
the actuals. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your, you said naive questions, but actually they were great. Thank you very much. I think Merve Hocam would like to
I have a very simple question, actually.
Okay.
So just going back to your data, you know, the sample in your data, I just wonder whether these firms have ever had any e-commerce retailing activities. I'm not sure whether I missed that part, even if you have mentioned in your presentation, but are those, I mean, any of the firms, do they have any sort of e-commerce retailing activities?
Sorry, what sort of retailing activities?
Like, you know, e-commerce shoppings or e-commerce, you know, like orders, internet orders, in terms of, you know, when we think about their internet activities.
No, not the internet activities. The internet activities is not a shutdown sector.
I see.
But that would be in the non-shutdown sectors.
Right. Okay.
So the shutdown sectors are the ones that are actually, they're shut down by the government.
I see.
So the government says, you know, these sectors are shut down, and they are shut down. Like, I mean, the typical example is restaurants, hotels, etc.
Right. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Could I add one thing on that? Sorry.
Okay.
I think there may be firms where they are shut down in their industries, but they may, I think that's Merve's question, they might continue operate through online sales. Marks and Spencer's are shut down, but you can still go and buy their stuff through their online activities. So I think that's Merve's question.
Exactly, that was, yeah.
I'm able to identify that.
You clarified.
So that's the reason we used another identifier for the shutdown industries. And that's the reason our identifier is kind of like more conservative. We look at the past 20 years and we're looking at a jump above 2 standard deviation in sales to put them into a shutdown sector. So the example could be Tesco, for example. Yeah. Tesco has a bank, Tesco has a retail shop, Tesco has an online shop, you know, Tesco has this, Tesco has that. Or the same thing could be Marks and Spencer's. They have an online shop, they have a Marks and Spencer's bank as well, and they have retail shops as well. So that's why we're using a more conservative estimate. and they're looking at, as a sector, the percentage drop in the sales.
I see.
Should be not 10% or 8%, which is 1/10. So that's how we started, 1/10 of the sales in a 1 month, in a 1 month shutdown. But we're looking at the actual fall being above the 2 standard deviation threshold, so that there is an abnormal fall in sales, because it's very difficult to identify that.
I see.
At the sectoral level or at the firm level, because most firms, especially the large firms, sometimes even the micro firms as well, have more than one operation. I mean, think about the micro firm, you know, they're kind of like a small restaurant. They close the restaurant, but they can still provide takeaway service.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to identify them on a firm-by-firm basis.
Firm-by-firm basis. I see. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there any other participants who would like to share their ideas or share their questions? Yeah, I think there are no other questions or comments. Thank you very much for both presenters of the day. And I'm looking forward to read the whole papers. So I'm sure the other participants feel the same thing with me. So I'm also thanking to Professor Merve and Özge for inviting me to moderate this session. It was a really great pleasure to me. And this gave me an opportunity to meet these distinguished professors. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And I think maybe I can leave the floor to the Merve Hocam. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's such a great honor for us to have actually 4 distinguished professors. So I really do hope that we can meet in another academic event. Thanks a lot for your participation and for your support. Now we're going to have a lunch break, and our next session is going to start. Well, it's still morning in the UK. It's already noon time at in Turkey. So we're going to have a lunch break, and then we will continue around 1 p.m. in the afternoon in the same hall. So thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Such a great start to the day. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Ben de çok teşekkür ediyorum Şenay Hocama, Gülnur Hocama, Gülçin Hocama çok teşekkür ediyorum.
Biz teşekkür ederiz.
Ve katkılarından dolayı sizlerle beraber olmak çok büyük bir onur bizler için de. Zaman ayırarak bizlerle böyle bilgileri paylaştınız. Bizim için çok değerli. İnşallah ben her şeyde de dile getiriyorum ama umarım hani böyle belki biz oralara geliriz. Belki sizin böyle davet etme buraya şansınız olur. Bu süreçler biter. Pandemiyi çabucak atlatırız diye umuyoruz, dua ediyoruz. Ve inşallah yüz yüze bir dahaki kongrelerimizde sizleri misafir etmeyi çok arzu ediyorum.
İnşallah. Çok teşekkürler.
Çok teşekkür ederim. Herkese iyi çalışmalar, iyi günler. Sağlıkla kalın. Hoşça kalın.
Hoşça kalın.